Hello, I'm Theron Muller, an associate professor at the University of Toyama and also a PhD student with the Open University in the UK. This presentation is scheduled to be given at the Japan Association of Language Teachers College and University Educators Special Interest Groups Conference in 2018. And so I'm recording this ahead of that conference, and then following the conference, once I've given my presentation, I'll upload this to my website. In today's presentation, I want to talk about one of the dilemmas that I tried to address in my PhD research, which was the issue of the visually representing the publication trajectories of manuscripts as they went through the journal evaluation and review process on their way toward publication. So I'm going to start the presentation by sharing what I could find in the literature about representing the publication trajectories of texts. I'm going to talk about some of the shortcomings of those available kind of solutions, and then I'll get into how I tried to address those shortcomings in my own research through the representation that I created. So the first of the three examples that I wanted to share is from Weller's 2001 book, which concerns mainly how editors interact with manuscripts and the process that manuscripts go through from the perspective of the journal. One thing that's worth keeping in mind is that this is a kind of hypothetical trajectory. It doesn't deal with a specific text, but is rather intended to be kind of generalizable to multiple texts or multiple manuscripts rather than concerning one specific manuscript trajectory. So, from my perspective, one of the issues with this is that it doesn't really show you what's happening on the author's side. It's more concerned with kind of the editorial manuscript handling process. And also, once you have an actual data for a text, once you have an actual text in front of you, how it moves through this process isn't immediately obvious looking at the correspondence between the editors and the authors in many cases, at least in my experience with my data. The second example from the literature that I wanted to share is Berrios' 2003 representation, which is concerned with the people who interact with the manuscript on its trajectory. And in particular, Berrios was interested in this concept of an author's editor, or somebody who may be correcting or changing the manuscript outside of the official journal publication or the official journal review process, working for the author as opposed to working for the journal. So that's the AE in this kind of spiral representation. Again, Berrios' representation is a hypothetical it concerns a hypothetical manuscript, and so it isn't based on specific empirical data, and it's mainly concerned with who is interacting with the manuscript and not so much with what they're doing when they interact with the manuscript and how the manuscript's changing. The third of the representations I wanted to talk about is from Lillian Kerry's 2006 journal article, and it's a little bit of a stretch to call this a graphical representation. They have some graphical lines added to a table, but it's much more kind of text-oriented, text-focused. It's interested in who is changing the manuscript and what changes they're making to the manuscript, but in that kind of focus, what's not as obvious is when these changes are being made in the manuscript's trajectory and who it is who's making those, or what the role of the people are who are making those changes. So are all of these people making these changes associated with the author, or are they associated with the journal, or kind of are they official brokers or unofficial brokers? That isn't as clear from this particular representation. So I wanted to kind of summarize where I'm at so far in this presentation before I jump into my own research. So The limitations of the representations that were available in the literature when I started looking were that they tended to represent idealized trajectories, and they focused on relatively limited aspects of the trajectories. A view of the editorial process in Miller's case, a view of selected brokers in Berrios' case, and then a view of changes made by who, but not necessarily when in the trajectory or the trajectory process in Lillian Kerry's case. So my kind of conclusion after looking at what was available was that what was lacking was an analysis of actual text trajectories, some kind of a view of the overall trajectory, trying to include as many brokers as possible, and then a view of both manuscript changes and information about how the manuscripts are being evaluated. So that's what I tried to address in my research. So next what I want to get into is the methodology of my overall investigation before I go more specifically into the text history graphic that I developed. So I frame my investigation as ethnographically informed, which from my perspective means taking time to do research, seeking insider perspectives, trying to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. On top of that kind of ethnographically informed methodology, I'm using new literacies, which views literacy as a social practice as opposed to a discrete skill. And then in analyzing how manuscripts change and the discourse of manuscript evaluation, I'm using critical discourse analysis, which is interested particularly in issues of power as they manifest in discourse, and how the language used in discourse perpetuates imbalances in power. So my overall investigation included 23 Japan-based authors working in the broad field of language, teaching, and higher education. There were 9 Japanese and 14 foreign residents of Japan. In the thesis itself, I concentrated on 7 core participants, and I did 6 text history analyses, along with critical discourse analysis of the correspondence. And what I'm going to concentrate on in this presentation today is those 6 text history analyses. So I want to go into a little bit more depth about those. So in addition to the 7 authors whose profiles I generated, those 7 authors authored 6 texts whose histories I evaluated. They authored more than 6 texts, but I chose 6 texts to analyze. The reason there's 7 authors and 6 texts is because one of the texts was co-authored by 2 of the author participants, the core author participants. So those text history analyses included an outside Japan indexed journal paper. Indexed means that it's included in a list of particularly prestigious journals. An outside Japan journal paper, so one journal paper published outside Japan, in a journal published outside Japan that it wasn't in one of those prestigious indexes. Journal paper published in a Japan-based journal, an outside Japan conference proceedings paper, a Japan conference proceedings paper, and then an outside Japan book chapter paper. And one of the dilemmas I always face when I do these presentations is thinking about how can I take the large volume of data I have and condense it down into the 20 minutes I have to present. And so my solution for today is to concentrate on one particular text history graphic and go into that in more detail, as opposed to trying to cover everything in a very kind of vague and unspecific way. So next I want to introduce the graphic, and then after I've introduced the graphic generally, I'll get into my specific analysis of the Outside Japan Index Journal paper written by Jason and Alan. All of the names of the authors are pseudonyms. They're not their actual names. So this is an example of the text history graphic I developed. Those orange numbers on the left are designed to make it a little bit easier to parse the information as I kind of summarize it. So 1 tries to track the timeline of publication, and it also includes information about all of the changes made to the manuscript from its first initial version to its final available or final published version. And then in between versions, there's more specific change information tracked about how many changes were made between each of those versions. I should note that those comparisons are using Microsoft Word, so it's a kind of automated comparison, which means that it's not ideal because one deletion of one word counts as a deletion, and one deletion of an entire paragraph also counts as one deletion. But obviously there's a difference in scale between deleting one word and deleting a paragraph. However, I think what it does do is it allows me to evidence the fact that there are a number of changes being made to the manuscripts throughout their trajectories. Number 2 concerns kind of the background to the manuscript. So in this case, it started as an undergraduate graduation thesis, and then it tracks the different versions of the manuscript that the authors made available to me to analyze, along with the evaluations received, and some information about who was doing the evaluating, or the brokers evaluating the manuscript. It also includes word length to try to capture a picture of how the manuscript's changing over time in terms of its overall length, and then some information about the different journals or publications that the manuscript was sent to. Number 3 at the bottom tries to capture some context about the fact that there's more going on in the author's lives than publishing this one specific paper, and there's some other things that are changing regarding the manuscript. For example, in this particular case, the student started with this manuscript being co-authored with his undergraduate supervisor, and then in the end it was published as a single-authored paper. And then it started off being submitted as a research paper, but then the journal changed that to a research note as opposed to a research paper prior to publication. And then this student both finished his undergraduate work, went through his master's studies, and then started in his PhD as the trajectory of this manuscript progressed. So I don't want to get into the specifics of this particular manuscript. This is not Jason and Alan's Outside Japan Indexed Journal manuscript. This is the text history for Jason and Alan's Outside Japan Indexed Journal text history. Again, you can see it's about 3 or 4 years from initial idea to publication. Every version of the manuscript includes changes, and I'm going to get into a little bit more detail in the next slides about what this particular text history graphic reveals regarding the overall trajectory of the manuscript. So first of all, you'll notice that versions 1 and 2 are changes made to the manuscript before it's submitted to review. So the first time the journal sees the manuscript is in version 3. So, for example, in Weller's representation, the version 1 and version 2 of the manuscript as captured in this particular text history would have been invisible, because Weller's representation basically deals with how the journal ends up working with or evaluating the manuscript. So that's one advantage that I see to the graphic that I've developed. Another point is that it also captures unofficial brokering that happens during the process. This is a point that Berrios tried to make with the author's editor's idea, but the author's editor's idea was kind of a limited concept dealing with proofreading the manuscripts, whereas in this particular case, the coworker who was consulted gave them advice about how to analyze their data, which I would argue is a little bit more depth than would generally be represented by something called proofreading. And then the other point that I wanted to make was that in, for example, Weller's representation, you had kind of 3 options. There was reject, revise, accept. But what I noticed in my data was even after the authors received an accept decision, which means that there wasn't going to be the need for further review, that manuscript was still changed considerably based on the editor's requests to make further changes. So in this particular case, the manuscript went from just under 5,000 words to just over 6,000 words because the editor asked them to add some information to their appendices, and there were also changes made to the manuscript in order to address concerns raised by the editor and then what was referred to as a copy editor in that correspondence. And those are just 3 examples from the overall trajectory to give you an idea of some of the complexity that's captured in this analysis. I could have picked some other points, but time is limited in my presentation, and those were insights that I felt this graphic made particularly apparent to me as I went through the data that I got from the authors regarding how their manuscripts changed. So, just to summarize some of the advantages I see of this graphic, it accommodates representations of actual text trajectories as opposed to hypothetical text trajectories. It can track manuscripts across different journals, which that example I showed right at the beginning tracked that manuscript across 3 different journals. It's not limited to an official broker view of the trajectory. It includes information about the volume of changes and the volume of evaluations, with the caveat that that information isn't necessarily as detailed as one might hope for it to be. And then it also includes information about the evaluations received. For example, in Jason and Alan's manuscript, where the accept evaluation came, there were still considerable changes made following that. And then I didn't want to just finish just focusing on my research. I wanted to try to think about some potential additional applications of this text history graphic outside of kind of the narrow band of my own research. In the future, I'm hoping to expand the fields covered in my own analysis of data beyond language teaching and language learning, writing for publication, to include fields such as medical research, engineering research, to examine the extent to which there are similarities and differences between and across fields. I'm also quite interested in analyzing changes to manuscripts that are written in languages other than English. So I did have some Japanese data for my PhD, but in the end, for a variety of reasons, I ended up not analyzing how the Japanese manuscripts changed over time. But again, I think it would be quite interesting to look at that topic, how manuscripts change, not just in English, but in a variety of different languages. And then, while I'm particularly interested in writing for publication, there's a number of other kind of official documents produced in academia, such as grant proposals, that may go through a similar kind of consultation and revision process that I think it would be worth investigating. And finally, I teach master's students through the University of Birmingham and the University of Leicester, and I feel there may be some interesting similarities between how authors' manuscripts change on their publication trajectories and how students, postgraduate students in this particular case, but it could also include undergraduate students, how student writing changes as they prepare manuscripts, consult with their tutors about those manuscripts and receive feedback, and then revise them in anticipation of submitting them for evaluation. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. If you're interested in contacting me about this, my email address is on the screen. My list of references is also on the screen there. And then I'll be uploading this to my website after I've given the live presentation in Tokyo. So you can also contact me through my website if you like. Thank you very much. I appreciate your taking the time to listen to my research today.